I'm going to start. I shan't say welcome to this segment because we will talk Gaza, and there's nothing welcome about what's happening there. But I'm grateful that you're here to hear news from the ground. Unfortunately, we have been punted across from Hall 2 at the last minute, and I just hope that we will have enough chairs for those who are interested in knowing what's happening in Gaza and also in the occupied Palestinian territories, which is the West Bank and Al-Quds, and also the Lebanese southern border, which is basically the northern border of Palestine. And I have with me here Leila Hatoum. Leila has a very long experience of doing multiple things actually. As a journalist, she has worked for the Wall Street Journal, she has worked for Daily Star in Beirut, for Newsweek Middle East when she was in the UAE. She deals with political economy by training. She is an international law expert. She was also the spokesperson of the Lebanese Prime Minister at one time. And a day before she boarded the flight for Pakistan, she was in southern Lebanon. Well, actually, she has been going there constantly ever since this conflict started. So she also has sources on the ground in the West Bank, also in Gaza. So she is really clued in to what's happening there. And we'll shortly get to know what's happening there. And I think there's a lot of interest in that. Having said that, before we start with Leila, I have a very dear friend, Rashid Mahmood Langrial here, the Federal Secretary. That's his day job, but he is also a poet of merit. And we are on a WhatsApp group, and he's been sharing with us his poetry on Gaza. And for today's session, he has his latest poem on Gaza. So I request Rashid to come and recite that poem, and then we'll kick off the session. Give him a
आपको आवाज आ रही? गजा की पट्टी सवाल बनकर बरोज़े महशर हिसाब लेगी। गजा की पट्टी सवाल बनकर बरोज़े महशर हिसाब लेगी। जो मर रहा था गजा का बच्चा तो मांगता भी बिलख रही थी। जो पानी बिजली के सारे सौते गजा के लोगों पे बंद थे तो हकूक़ आदम किधर गए? हकूक़ आदम किधर गए थे? अमान के ज़ामन कहाँ खड़े थे? हमें बताते थे अहले मग़रिब, ज़माना जो था वो अब नहीं है। जहान नौ के हैं और इंसान सभी बराबर, तमाम यकसा। जदीद कदरों में कट है कोई सफ़ेद काला या गरबी शक्की? सभी असूलों से मावरा था, सभी असूलों से मावरा था करोद उनका जो पक चुका था। सभी असूलों से मावरा था करोद उनका जो पक चुका था। हज़ारों सालों की बेघरी में उबल पड़ा था गजा के ऊपर, उबल पड़ा था गजा के ऊपर करोद सारा हजार साला। जदीद कदरों के सारे गुंबद गजा की पट्टी में मुनहदिम थे। जदीद कदरों के सारे गुंबद गजा की पट्टी में मुनहदिम थे। गजा की पट्टी में क्या बचा है? वो पाक दामन हजारों रूएं, جو مرکزوں میں بسی ہوئی ہیں، یا آپ دیدہ سی وہ دعائیں جو بوڑھی آنکھوں میں جم گئی، غزہ کی پٹی سوال بن کر بروز محشر حساب لے گی، بروز محشر خدا کے آگے گواہی دے گی غزہ کی عورت، بروز محشر خدا کے آگے گواہی دے گی غزہ کی عورت، جو چل رہی تھی فنا کی آندھی، ہماری وادی ہمارے گھر میں، پلٹ کے دیکھا عدو کا خیمہ، وہیں کھڑے تھے تمام رہبر کہ جن کے ناروں کی گھن گرج سے اتھل پتھل تھے بہور برسب، ذرا سنبھل کے جو میں نے دیکھا، سبھی کے ہاتھوں میں جام جم، سبھی کے ہاتھوں میں جام جم تھا، دکھائی دیتا تھا سب کو جسم، مگر تھے سہمے وہ شر کے آگے، مگر تھے سہمے وہ شر کے آگے، مقابلے سے ہی کامتے تھے، مقابلے سے ہی کامتے تھے۔ غزہ کی پٹی سوال بن کر بروز محشر حساب لے گی، بروز محشر خدا کے آگے غزہ کا بچہ گواہی دے گا کہ زور سارا تھا گفتگو پر، کہ زور سارا تھا گفتگو پر، عرب کہاں کے عجم کہاں کے، وہ مال و دولت و شان و شوکت و تاج و در شہنشاہوں کے، غرور ملت کہیں نہیں، غرور ملت کہیں نہیں تھا، جو کچھ بچا تھا وہ ڈر گیا تھا، جو کچھ بچا تھا وہ ڈر گیا تھا۔ غزہ کی پٹی سوال بن کر بروز محشر حساب لے گی، بروز محشر خدا کے آگے غزہ کا غازی گواہی دے گا، بروز محشر خدا کے آگے غزہ کا غازی گواہی دے گا، جو سارے لشکر کبھی مصر تھے کہ بیت اقدس پہ حرف آیا تو ہم رہیں گے یا وہ رہیں گے، جو سارے لشکر کبھی مصر تھے کہ بیت اقدس پہ حرف آیا تو ہم رہیں گے یا وہ رہیں گے، وہ ضبط بالا کی قید میں تھے، وہ ضبط بالا کی قید میں تھے، وہ زور ظالم کے سحر میں تھے، بہت تھا سامان حرب لیکن مدد کو آئے نہ دل پسیجا، مدد کو آئے نہ دل پسیجا، اڑان پر کرتے تھے اور جانب بطرف گناہ نہ کوئی آیا، سکوت مسکن میں پرسکوت سو میرے حصے گریز آیا، سو میرے حصے، غزہ کا بچہ گواہی دے گا، سو میرے حصے گریز آیا، نہ توپ داغی نہ تیر برسا، نہ تیغ نکلی نہ شعلہ لپکا، میرے حصے گریز آیا۔ غزہ کی پٹی سوال بن کر بروز محشر حساب دے گی، بروز محشر خدا کے آگے غزہ کا بوڑھا گواہی دے گا، دوا نہ دارو نہ آب و دانا، دوا نہ دارو نہ آب و دانا، گو نیل والوں سے ہمدمی تھی، دوا نہ دارو نہ آب و دانا، گو نیل والوں سے ہمدمی تھی، خدائے محشر میں کیسے بھولوں وہ شک کے اردن کی ہچکچاہٹ، کنارہ کش وہ حجاز والے، وہ شک کے اردن کی ہچکچاہٹ، کنارہ کش وہ حجاز والے، زمین کہرے بشر سے شک تھی گواہی ایسی فلک بھی کانپا، زمین کہرے بشر سے شک تھی گواہی ایسی فلک بھی کانپا، غزہ کے لوگوں کے تشنہ لب سے امیر کوثر گواہی دیں گے، غزہ کے لوگوں کے تشنہ لب سے امیر کوثر گواہی دیں گے، بروز محشر خدا کے آگے سوال ہوگا، حساب ہوگا، حساب ہوگا۔ بہت شکریہ۔
I'll also provide the translation later. Yeah. So here's the thing. Before I start off with Leila, I want to say a couple of things just to give you a perspective on what's happening. So one of the questions that constantly arises is, why did Hamas attack Israel on 7th October? So on the Western side, history seems to begin on 7th October. It did not begin in 7th October. It began in 1948, what's called the Nakba, the catastrophe, and then 67. But even before, let's forget about Gaza for a while. In the occupied Palestinian territories, since the Oslo agreements, there has been a system of slow and structured violence against Palestinians, essentially giving them a choice between extermination or exile. And this violence is at all levels of their lives, whether it is through checkpoints, and hundreds of checkpoints dot that. As a matter of fact, there is an Israeli volunteer organization called Hatoum Watch. Hatoum is Hebrew for checkpoints, and they've been recording this. What happens to the Palestinians at those checkpoints? What kind of daily humiliations they have to go through at those checkpoints? The Palestinians have their own roads. They cannot ply cars or walk on roads meant for Israelis, for the Jewish people of Israel. They have different colored license plates, so that their vehicles can be spotted from a distance by the Israeli security forces. Their houses are demolished, their orchards are demolished, water is controlled by Israel, their revenues are controlled by Israel. And this, I'm talking about areas that are under the nominal control of the Palestinian Authority. Gaza, of course, as we all know by now, has been an open prison since Israeli withdrawal from that city. There was a lot of violence in Al-Aqsa in the run-up to October 7. If you look at what Hamas said, the reasons that Hamas gave for its attack, the general treatment of Palestinians, what was happening in Al-Aqsa, the settler violence, incidentally, that's another thing. You have all these settlers, initially Eastern Europeans, now a large number of American Jewish people who come and they settle in these areas, which is essentially on Palestinian lands. And since October 7, they have also been generally using army fatigues. So you cannot differentiate between whether this is the IOF. I call IDF the IOF because it's an Israeli occupation force, and these settlers. So this is the ecosystem in which things happened on October 7, and things are happening since October 7. So now I'll just get to Leila. Leila, so the way I'm going to play this is for you to give an opening statement of whatever 5 to 6 or 7 minutes that you think, and essentially the important points with reference to for a general understanding of the audience here. And I will intermittently ask you questions, but I also want to immediately open the floor so that the audience here can ask questions, identify themselves, and I want them to get a sense of what's happening. So over to you.
First of all, good evening to everyone, and I'm sorry that I don't speak Hebrew. I know some words, but if you need to ask your question in Urdu, it's fine. I do have Ejaz over here to translate, and if you don't understand certain things that I said, you can ask him in Urdu and he can respond as well. I hope that you actually do that. Thank you. The day before I arrived over here, as Ejaz said, I was at the southern Lebanese front, where the Israelis have been pounding and bombarding civilian Lebanese villages across the blue line. And you have to understand the situation between Lebanon and the occupied Palestinian territories. There is no border at the moment. It's the blue line, which actually marks the withdrawal of the Israeli forces from most of southern Lebanon in the year 2000. The blue line is demarcated by the United Nations, which says it is not a border line. the borders between Lebanon and Palestine have been drawn since the 1920s. With Israel, we don't have any borders. We don't confess that there is Israel. We're at a state of war with the Israeli occupation forces. I will start with Gaza because some of my best friends and boots on the ground live there. 2 of them have died. They were killed. They were targeted by the Israeli occupation forces. I still have boots on the ground and reporters who feed me information on a daily basis. I also have informants from behind enemy lines. Those are Israelis who are against what their own government is doing on the ground. And I do have also informants in the West Bank. And why do I say the West Bank? It's because it's not only a war on Gaza. October 7 happened. The same day you had settlers, illegal settlers in the West Bank attacking Palestinian civilians, killing a 17-year-old Palestinian farmer who was picking up olives with his parents. Now you have to understand the West Bank does not have Hamas. According to the Israelis, they're attacking Hamas because Hamas did the October 7 attacks. But the West Bank is a completely different area. There's a large, vast land between Gaza and the West Bank, so there's no excuse to attack people over there. What the world fails to understand is that even the United Nations and the United States call the West Bank the occupied Palestinian territories. They confess that it is being occupied by the Israeli occupation forces. There are hundreds of settlements, illegal settlements across the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank, and that's about 720 to 750,000 illegal Israeli settlers living over there, as well as about 220,000 illegal Israeli settlers living in East Jerusalem. Why do I say East Jerusalem? It's because East Jerusalem is under the Palestinian Authority's authority. And during the Arab Peace Initiative, at one point they said, we agreed to the partition where basically East Jerusalem is for the Arab, West Jerusalem goes for the Israelis. The Israelis moved their own settlers over there. They are heavily armed. They have been armed to the teeth by one of the most radical ministers in Israel. His name is Itamar Ben-Gvir. And those people are carrying attacks on a daily basis that the media has intentionally carried out, a blackout, literally a media blackout on whatever is happening in the West Bank since October 7. To take it to the situation in West Bank and Gaza before that, every single year, between 230 to 280 Palestinians were being killed, shot and killed. Those are civilians, Palestinian civilians, in the West Bank and Gaza. Before October 7, for no reason. Somebody would be stopped at the checkpoint and shot dead. Then they will claim that basically he was carrying a knife attack. We had footage of Israeli soldiers throwing a knife next to the body just to claim that this person is trying to carry out a knife attack at one point or another. We also had footage of Israeli settlers, illegal settlers, going around cutting down hundreds of years of old olive groves, olive trees. Remember, those trees are even older than the occupation itself. And they're cutting out those trees not because it's just the livelihood of the Palestinians, but also because they bear witness that there was a population over here doing agriculture, living in peace, producing oil and olive oil and olives. So the idea is that when you cut it down and then you build your settlements, you eradicate that presence. So October 7 did not happen out of voidness. Moving to Gaza, Gaza has been under total blockade by the Israelis for the past 16 years. Back in 2006 until 2008, if you remember, there was democratic elections in Gaza that was monitored by the whole world. Jimmy Carter was one of the monitors on the ground, confessing to the democracy of that election. The whole world thought that the Palestinians in Gaza were going to elect the Palestinian Authority, basically Fatah and other factions. People in Gaza who had been brutalized by the Israelis opted to vote for Hamas. Hamas, you have to understand, it didn't come from Mars or Venus. It's a political group on the ground that represents the people and is part of the people in Gaza. And those people said, no, we don't want an occupation. We don't want to be brutalized. We don't want to live like slaves or dogs or animals at any point. So Hamas was democratically elected under the world's vision, under the world's eyes and supervision. The world refused that. The Americans refused the democratic elections result. The Israelis refused that, and consequently they bombarded Gaza. They put it under siege for 16 years. And when I say under total blockade, that means even the fishermen cannot go out beyond 6 miles from the beach, which means they cannot bring in big fish. It's only shrimps and the smaller fish. If they go beyond 6 miles, the Israeli Navy would actually shoot at them, not to harm them, but to kill them. And we ran a story in 2016 about the matter. One of my reporters, Sami Abu Salim, actually boarded one of the fishermen ships, and he tried to go out and report on it at 5 a.m. in the morning. So it's not something that basically we're making up, it's all recorded. When we say blockade, I'll give you an example. Coriander. We exposed that years ago, and people didn't believe us. Coriander was banned from going into Gaza. Why? Nobody knows. The Israeli director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was asked, why are you banning coriander from going into Gaza? I mean, like it's a herb. You use it for food to enhance the taste. And he said, I don't know, I have to look into it. They banned wedding dresses. They banned critical medication. They banned building material. They banned cancer medication as well. Anybody who wanted to be treated from critical illnesses, they had to apply for a permit from the Israelis to be able to leave through the Eretz border crossing between Gaza and the Gaza enclave settlements, to be able to go to the West Bank or outside to receive medication. And one of my reporters on the ground at the time, back in 2017, wrote us a story where the Israelis were forcing anybody who wants to go and get medication outside to work with them as an informant. Otherwise, they're not allowed to leave. People opted to die in Gaza rather than work as informants. There are informants, but to what extent they're abusing people's illnesses to force them to snitch on their own people so that they can actually receive medication. Now, this is somehow, people might think that this is inhumane, but Israel has the right to self-defense. Under international law, Israel is an occupation. Under international law, it occupies the West Bank. It occupies parts of the Gaza Strip as well. So under international law, an occupation is an aggressor. It has zero rights to self-defense. And these are not my words, these are the words of international law. I hold a master's degree in international law, and these are the words of United Nations officials themselves. They went out and said, an occupation does not have the right to self-defense. So on October 7, what happened? I was reporting on it from day one until literally 2 days ago. You had a resistance group. Under international law, you have the right, if you are under occupation, to fight that occupation anywhere, anytime, by any means possible, including armed resistance, including using arms. And you have the right to not target civilians, but if there are casualties among civilians and you're not targeting them directly, that's fine under international law. And the sad truth is fine, it's because the Allies back in the war, during World War II, they were trying to cover up for the French resistance, Charles de Gaulle, who was fighting the Nazi occupation of France, and he used to target civilians who were operating with the Nazi occupation of France. So you cannot consider a resistance group as terrorists under international law. That's why the United Nations, until today, has not put Hamas or Hezbollah under the terrorist organizations. Why? Because Israel occupies Lebanese territories, according to United Nations, and Israel occupies Palestinian territories under the United Nations. So that, under international law as well. So that gives people, Palestinians and Lebanese, the right to resist. So they are resistance, not terrorists. And this is what the international media fails to tell you. I worked with international media for the longest time. I worked for the Wall Street Journal. I worked for regional media like Al Arabiya News Channel. I reported as a fixer for Washington Post, New York Times, and others, and they always try to alter their words. You have to understand there's an international agenda to hide the situation on the ground. It is an occupation. People under occupation have the right to resist, and they are not at any point to be considered terrorists. Otherwise, the French resistance will be considered terrorists back during World War II. And the Jews of Warsaw and Poland in 1943, when they fought off the Nazi occupation and the blockade of the ghettos that they lived in, they would be also considered terrorists at that point. So either you balance it the same, or you actually go and confess that you are a hypocrite as an international community, trying to claim one side as terrorists, and the other side who's doing the same, you claim them as heroes. So the Gazans on October 7, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other basically people on the ground who were supporting those resistance groups, They had been training for years for that moment, and when they saw the moment happening, they went in. They targeted armed Israelis. The festival was not filled with civilians, you have to understand. Anybody who is aged 18 and up in Israel until the age of 60, 65 are considered either reservists or Israeli occupation forces. They have to serve for 2 years for men, 2 years and a half, women for 18 months and up, a year and a half and plus. So they're all reservists, they are all armed. If they're having a festival next to the fence of the largest open-air prison in the world, that doesn't basically make them civilians. That's one. Two, they started putting out propaganda, which myself and 25 other journalists across the world that we know, we collected ourselves and we said, we're going to debunk every propaganda that comes out. So we're going to look whether it's true or not. Even if it's against the Palestinians, we're going to write that the Palestinians did it. We found out that there were no beheaded babies. So we went out and we actually debunked it by evidence. We challenged the Israelis to give us photos or names. Why? Because we already had obtained several names of the people who were killed on the ground. None of them was a child. Only one child was killed. He was age 7. Some people say he's age 10. And he died as a consequence of the Israeli occupation forces bombarding the building that he was at. Not a single child was beheaded or burned in the oven, as they claimed. And when we were hearing those propaganda, it hit me as a history. If you go back, the settlers, the occupiers back in the 1940s, were the ones who burned babies, Palestinian babies. They were the ones who decapitated Palestinian babies. They raped children aged 14 and 16 back in the 1940s to push the Palestinians out. And then they actually took those narratives and they plastered them against the Palestinians. So when you hear the Israelis saying, for example, a Palestinian killed a 3-year-old over here, put it in your mind it's actually an Israeli who actually killed a Palestinian baby aged 3, and they're trying to reverse the narrative. And we managed to debunk everything. There were no women who were raped. Even the Israeli police went out and said, we couldn't find people to come as witnesses to basically say that those women were raped. One person came out and he said, I heard them cry when they were being raped. Turns out this person was not even in the whole festival area. He was a liar. So they were lying, one lie after the other actually discredited them on the international level because international reporters, independent international reporters, took it as a mission to debunk the lies. And now whatever the Israelis are saying, people are questioning it and taking it not only with a bucket of salt, not a pinch of salt, but with the whole sea of salt. And that's why Israel has lost its credibility in front of the world. Even the international media cannot cover up for everything that they're doing. And at the end of the day, now they're flagrantly, just saying basically, we're killing them, they are animals. You hear the officials saying that. Palestinians are animals. And then they start using verses from the Tanakh and Pentateuch, basically their holy books, that they are Amalek, which means we can kill them, we can kill their animals, we can kill their children, we can destroy their homes, we can cut off their trees. Who in their right mind can do that? If the Muslims did it, or even Christians did it, they will be directly called radical Christians or terrorist Muslims, because terrorism is only synonymous to Muslims according to international media and to the Israelis. Imagine a Muslim coming out and saying, I want to kill all the Jews. All Muslims would be terrorists. If he uses part of the verse of the Quran is an evil book to them. But if the Israelis, the Zionists do it, that's okay. And why do I say Zionist? Because there's a big difference between Zionism and Judaism. ISIS, for example, uses parts from the Quran, they claim that they are Muslims, to attack and kill other Muslims. This is not Islam. Same thing goes with Zionists. They take parts of Judaic teachings and they twist it to justify the evil doing that they do, the evil events that they're doing on the ground, to justify their craziness, their bloodthirst. And I have lots of Jewish friends who refuse to go to Israel because they believe, according to their own teachings, that they cannot go back to the Holy Land until their Messiah, the Messiah, comes back. He comes and he ushers them to his kingdom over there. So having a state-like place for Jews at the moment without the Messiah coming is against the religious teachings. But Zionists twist the teachings and say like, no, we are allowed to be there. There are Jews who are against the killing because in the Tanakh you actually read the word, okay, you kill your enemy as a revenge, but forgiveness is best. Just like in Islam, it always says, but forgiveness is best. This is basically a heavenly religion, and they turned it into something ugly. That's why lots of Jews across the world are against this as well. So Zionists are not Jews in the terms of teachings, much like the Nazis do not represent all of the Christians, much like basically radical groups in any other religion, be it in Islam or any other religion, do not represent the religions. So this is the whole situation in a nutshell. The Palestinians are literally doing a retaliation to decades of offense against them by the Israelis. And now karma is a big thing. The only nation that stood from day one until the end with the apartheid regime in South Africa was Israel. And now South Africa, the ones who were liberated, are taking the Israeli apartheid regime to the ICJ to try them over there.
So that kind of sets the tone for this. Just before I open it to the floor, a couple of things, and important things, because these are things that actually give you insights into the Israeli Zionist thinking. And also, when you juxtapose that with the kind of everyday humiliations and indignities that are heaped on the Palestinians, that then gives you a clearer perspective on why Hamas did. It's like, flipping the coin on a very simple question. And that simple question is, do we want to be exterminated and / exiled, or do we want to fight? And Hamas chose to fight. Back when Menachem Begin was the Israeli Prime Minister, and this is an incident that is quoted in one of the books of the late Egyptian journalist Mohammed Hakel. Mohammed Hakel was not just a journalist, he was also a scholar. He was someone who personally knew almost every single royal family or ruling clan in the entire Greater Middle East, in the MENA region. So Menachem Begin was asked by a reporter, what are the borders of Israel? And Begin just turned around and said, but they are all given in the Bible. The reason I make this point is that the term Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is something that is deeply ingrained in the Zionist psychology. Before October 7, when this current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, went to the United Nations General Assembly, he took with him a map of Israel, which showed Gaza, Al-Quds, West Bank, Galilee, and parts of Lebanon as part of Israel. And he had the gumption to actually brandish that map at the United Nations. Now, these are things that when Israel's Western allies are supporting Israel, they would want the entire world and Charlie's Aunt to ignore all these things. But the Palestinians who have constantly suffered, and those who observe, some of us who are outside but observe these, we know exactly what these symbols mean. There's substance behind these symbols. Netanyahu's government is widely, within Israel and outside Israel, branded as the most right-wing government in the history of Israel. Leila mentioned Itamar Ben-Gvir, there's Bezalel Smotrich, both of them. And these are two ministers. One is the Minister for Finance, the other is the Minister for National Security. two of the most important portfolios. Both of them are illegal settlers. And not only are they illegal settlers, they have been actually advancing further illegal settlements. Ben is also someone who has been earlier indicted on terror charges. He's holding a portfolio of national security. He used to have a picture of Baruch Goldstein in his drawing room, and Baruch Goldstein was someone, a terrorist, a Zionist terrorist, who massacred 27 Palestinians in Al-Aqsa. And so, interestingly enough, and then we'll start with questions. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli right-wing youth. He was considered to be a dove, someone who wanted to make peace with Palestinians. 29 days before he was assassinated, when he put the Oslo Agreement, Oslo II, in front of the Knesset for ratification, he made a speech there. And I can see my editor at the Friday Times standing there. My latest article, I've actually mentioned and given hyperlinks. If you go and read his speech, you will see that Rabin tells the Knesset members that this agreement is for peace with the Palestinians to enhance Israeli security, but this does not mean, and I repeat, this is what he has said, this does not mean that they are going to have a sovereign state. So even someone who tried to make peace with was not prepared to give the Palestinians a sovereign state. So this whole thing about the two-state solution, and if you go back to that famous article that Edward Said, the late Edward Said, wrote in the London Review of Books, he criticized this whole two-state solution and gave his reasons for that. Anyway, I would request you to ask questions. Just identify yourself and ask questions, and we will then. So what we are going to do is that we'll take 3 questions and lump them, and don't worry, we'll have enough. So first you, ma'am, then.
By the way, you can ask me questions about the victims on the ground, the numbers, the Israeli losses, economic losses, what the Yemenis are doing and the Iraqis are doing as well at the same time. All questions are acceptable. Anything.
Thank you. The most important thing which everyone, I think, wants to know, why the word is silent, especially with specific emphasis on the Arab world or the Muslim world, why there is no serious retaliation. And secondly, sir, what about Pakistan's state? Why we are silent regarding Gaza's issue? Only the civilians are basically retaliating and contributing for this cause. So what are the basic reasons that there is no serious retaliation regarding this issue? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Leila, for coming all the way here. My question is a little beyond the obvious situation in Gaza. It is more about the second order effect of what is happening in Gaza and how it's going to shape the Arab world moving forward. The Arab rulers, UAE, KSA, Jordan, they are not condemned, or they are in cahoots with the Israeli government, or they had understanding. But the people of Arab world, they are, of course, they are enraged. So this effect, this social contract between the Arab rulers and the people they rule, are you seeing any change in that because of the Gaza? Gaza is the catalyst that's going to bring in the change, like so-called Arab Spring of 10 years ago? Number one. Number two, do you see this conflict, engulfing the region, wider region, or transforming into something which, it is uncontrollable? So these are the 2 questions. Thank you very much.
Hi, Leila. Thank you so much for coming all the way here to speak with us. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the situation in Lebanon, because I've seen less reporting on that. Not just the Israeli attack, but I was wondering, the Israeli attacks, but also I was wondering if there's resistance fighting in South Lebanon right now. And related to that, historically, Hezbollah has said that a ground invasion in Gaza or attacks on South Lebanon are like their red line. And so I was also wondering, like, domestically, what has been the conversation around Hezbollah and where they're going and, like, the position that they're taking in terms of the entire situation. Thank you.
Thank you. So what we're going to do is 3 more hands. You. Okay. So we'll take these 3 questions and then we'll go to.
I'll start with basically the Arab reaction and the silence, and if it's going to change anything on the ground for them. So those are 2 questions combined. Not all the Arab states were silent from day one. You have to understand, for example, Kuwait was very vocal against what's happening in Gaza and Palestine in general. You have Lebanon, it was vocal. Iraq was vocal, Yemen was vocal. There were certain states that were silent, but there are also states among those who didn't do a military action who were also vocal. Something that the media doesn't show you, especially the mainstream media in the US, which is against some of the monarchies, for example, in the GCC and elsewhere. So I'll give you an example. Saudi Arabia issued 3 statements so far on Gaza, condemning what the Israelis are doing, refusing to continue with negotiations towards normalizing ties with the Israelis, and when they refused to do so, Blinken ran stories in the mainstream media in the US saying, oh, the Saudis are looking forward to normalizing ties after all of this is over. However, my own people within Saudi Arabia who told me something that actually later on turned out to be true, they said Blinken had asked if the Saudis wanted to continue with normalizing ties with the Israelis, and the response from the leadership was, if the Israelis agree to cease fire and to a 2-state solution based on the 1967 lands, we would go and continue with those normalized ties, like the discussions. And the US media ran the story as such. Saudi Arabia is still looking forward towards basically normalizing ties with the Israelis. Completely different thing. Completely different thing. So don't listen to everything that the media says. However, you have to understand why the Saudis didn't mobilize military-wise or directly do diplomatic solutions on the ground and force people to actually, or the Israelis, to force the Israelis at any point to stop directly. That's for a main reason. It's not only the Saudis, the Emiratis and the Bahrainis as well, at one point or another. It's because they do have a conflict with the Muslim Brotherhood. To the GCC nations, and that's the whole GCC nation, they have a list of terrorist organizations that includes the Muslim Brotherhood. And Hamas is funded by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is indirectly in league with Qatar. And that explains also the fight between some of the GCC nations among each other against Qatar. If you remember what happened basically 4 or 5 years ago, actually 6 years ago now. So the whole idea, they cannot go and support or endorse Hamas as resistance on the ground when they actually have it as a terrorist group. But what the Saudis did on the other hand is that they started doing the underground diplomacy where basically they started speaking to leaders across the world for a ceasefire. However, it's a matter that's not in their hands because they don't have direct ties with Hamas. The ones who have that are the Qataris who were delegated by Hamas to actually negotiate on their behalf, as well as basically they delegated Moscow. If you remember, shortly after the October 7 attacks happened, you had Haniya, the political arm of Hamas, traveling to Doha, Qatar, and then traveling to Moscow to speak with the Russians and the Qataris in case there's an exchange of prisoners or talks. You are the guys who are going to speak in our name. You are the ones who are going to do negotiations because we're not going to speak to the Israelis directly. So some of the Arab nations did not mobilize military-wise. They weren't that vocal in condemning Hamas, but some of them, of those who remained silent, they issued condemnation statements. And that includes a statement that was issued 2 days ago by the Saudi prince, the foreign affairs minister, who actually condemned what the Israelis are doing and said that we are supporting Gaza. Again, he repeated that. What is late from the Arab world and the Muslim world was the collective reaction. They waited for several weeks before they actually convened over what's happening in Gaza, despite the fact that the massacre was going on the ground, in front of everybody's eyes. And it wasn't until earlier this week that the Arab League, 22 Arab states, came together and they supported South Africa and what it's doing, filing a lawsuit against Israel in the ICJ. So the Arab League actually issued a statement earlier this week that they are supporting or endorsing South Africa's lawsuit against Israel. This is a good thing, but 4 months later on. So that's because of the political rift between certain organizations and those states at the same time. How it's going to impact those states, I highly doubt it's going to change anything for them for a reason. Because the Saudis from day one, the Qataris from day one, Kuwaitis from day one, even the Emiratis from day one, allowed their own population to collect donations. And they sent those donations directly to Gaza via Egypt. And some of them managed to get those donations inside, including UAE and Saudi Arabia, because of the connections they had with the Americans at one point or with the Israelis at another point. So they managed to help on the ground. Now, the sad part for me, like, I mean, not only as an Arab or as a reporter, but as a human being, I would have expected more from the Arab states. They do have the force, they do have the money, and they do have the ability to go and wring the international community's hand by saying, we're not going to import items from you. Economic sanctions on the international world, not the other way around. You don't cut off oil. Oil is not a weapon at the moment, you have to understand, because lots of people keep asking me, Leila, why didn't the Arab world cut off oil? And I tell them, back in 1973, the Arab nations, part of the oil pie in the world, the market share was really high. So when they actually did the oil blockade, or they cut off oil, they managed to not only spike oil prices up, but they created a crisis. It was called the oil crisis back in the 70s. The result of that is that there were other nations who were producing oil, took the market share instead of the Arabs. Now the collective Arab states' market share of oil across the world now is about 1/3, 30% only. If you cut it off, what does that mean? Saudi Arabia is not number one in producing anymore, it's the USA. And there are countries outside OPEC who also produce oil. OPEC doesn't control all of the oil that is produced around the world, not even OPEC plus. So if the Arab world decides to cut off producing oil and sending it to the world, there are other nations who are going to ramp up, increase their production. And what does that mean? They will cap on the higher prices and sell it for higher prices. There will be an extra supply in the market that will push the prices down to near zero at one point. We saw it going negative when if you remember 2 years ago, oil prices went down to negative because there were no places to actually store the supply. There was extra supply than demand, and nobody was basically able to ship it because of the COVID hitting international trade. So it will be the same situation. Countries ramping up their supply of oil because they want to cap up on the high prices. There will be extra supply than demand, and the oil prices will fall directly the same week, and the only people who will benefit from that are the Israelis and Americans. They will get oil for cheap. So oil is not an arm at the moment. It's not a weapon at the moment. What the Arab countries can do, GCC nations included, they stop importing items from the rest of the Western world and those who are supporting Israel. Most of the trade, billions, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of food, clothing, building material, vehicles, construction, like everything that you can think of that the Arab world imports from the West, stopped for 1 week. What would that do to the big conglomerates in the West? They will start losing money. If they lose money, they are their own lobbies. Those businesses, food businesses, pharmaceuticals businesses, all of these people are lobbyists, so they will go and lobby their own governments to change their stand. But the Arab world did not see eye to eye when it comes to Gaza, and they failed to use that as a weapon. That's the sad part. I finished with that. I'm going to the next one. So when it comes to Lebanon, I'm a person who was born 1 year before the second Israeli invasion to Lebanon of 1982. I was born 1981. The first invasion was 1978. We had collective people from the southern Lebanese villages and the Bekaa and other areas across Lebanon coming together to form a resistance on the ground against the Israelis. And later on, that resistance shifted to several groups, including Hezbollah. Hezbollah was announced as a group that's fighting the Israeli occupation to Lebanon and other foreign elements on the ground in 1985. Before 1985, they hadn't assembled in a unified body. At the moment, we do have Hezbollah. It's heavily armed. It's one of the strongest armed resistance groups, not only in the Middle East, but across the world. Because they are unified, they do have a central command, they do have strategic weapons, And they do have the guerrilla warfare experience. Remember, their people had not only fought against the Israelis for 15 years before the Israelis unilaterally withdrew from most of South Lebanon. They fought from 1985 until 2000. But they also took part in the Syria war, where they were fighting ISIS and other radical groups on the ground to prevent them from coming into Lebanon, because we do have a long shared borders with the Syrian side. And after almost 11 years, 12 years of fighting over there, they do have that experience. And then they also took part in training the Yemenis in fighting on the ground. So they do have that experience, and they do have their own people being trained by Iran, and not only in Iran, but across the world as well in friendly nations. So this is what the Israelis fear. Hezbollah is not Hamas. Hamas has been under blockade for 15 years. Not a single weapon would be able to enter Gaza, so Hamas started manufacturing their own weapons, makeshift weapons, and they're still actually standing until today. They're resistant, like they're still enduring and patient. When it comes to Lebanon, Lebanon is an open country. You can actually import weapons via the black market. You can smuggle weapons in, so you can imagine what kind of weapons they have. And they outnumber Hamas. So Hamas has about 25,000, Hamas and Islam Jihad, they have about 25,000 soldiers on the ground, fighters on the ground. Give or take those who died. Hezbollah has about 100,000 fighters. Well-trained, heavily armed, and they have no elsewhere to go, so they have to defend their own land. Whereas the Israelis don't feel that this land is theirs, so when they fight, they don't have that willpower. The other thing that actually stands in line with Hezbollah is that people from Hezbollah who are fighting in the south are people from the south. So they know their terrain very well, and they have their own dialect, not language dialect. So for example, and this is a joke that Hezbollah Secretary General always gives when he gives his speeches. He says, two people from a southern village that's being attacked by the Israelis, and they are defending that village. They have lived in that village for all their life. If one person is called Muhammad, the other one is called Ali, they want to speak to each other, they have nicknames. Ali, Shi, Hamoudi, whatever it is. It's like, Ali, do you remember where Zaina kissed Ibrahim near the black tree next to that forest? You know where? Behind the Israelis will not know which tree is called the black tree. They don't know basically who is Zaina. There's 100 Zainas in the town. They don't know which Ibrahim is it. So that is on its own a code that the resistance group in Lebanon used for the longest time. The Israelis couldn't crack it until today. Whereas most of the fighters in the south, they know Hebrew. So they can crack the Israeli codes at any point. And the Israelis have no advantage when it comes to secret languages. That's one thing. The other thing is that from the beginning of this war, Hezbollah made sure to destroy every single espionage tower and equipment that the Israelis had erected along the blue line to spy on Lebanon. So they were flying half-blind from the first week of the war. They had to send in their drones to Lebanon. Remember, they hadn't sent their drones for almost over 2 years. Why? Because they found out that Hezbollah was actually hacking into these drones and seeing what the Israelis were actually monitoring. So they had to rely on the drones again because they were flying half-blind because of the destruction of their espionage towers along the blue line. Hezbollah introduced something that the Israelis didn't know Hezbollah had, was the half-ton bomb, the Burkan missile. They introduced the winged missile that nobody knew that they had. A winged missile doesn't fly straight, it flies in circles and around, so you can't actually target it when it's flying. They introduced attack drones. The Israelis didn't know that Hezbollah had them. So these are 3 new things that they introduced, which means that Hezbollah has far superior weapons that they haven't used yet. And this is what the Israelis are afraid of. The media is not covering the southern Lebanese front because it's not a sexy story until now. And this is your answer to your question. Until a fully fledged front is open in Lebanon, it's not a sexy story for the international media, because then it will turn into a Hezbollah versus Israel. At the moment, it's just basically clashes or mini war along the southern borders. It hasn't expanded. Nasrallah didn't say if basically Israel invades Lebanon or attacks Lebanon. Nasrallah said if the Israeli behavior towards Lebanon changes, or the situation in Gaza changes. By the situation in Gaza, he means if Hamas asks for help, Hamas hasn't asked Hezbollah's help so far, we will then take measures to expand things. What he means by that is, until now, Hamas has not asked for help, which tells you that Hamas is already prepared and they can last for a long time. And the second thing is that Israel continues to bombard only that strip of villages, Lebanese villages, along the blue line. They haven't bombarded Beirut. They haven't done a land incursion, and they haven't basically bombed us from the sea. That would constitute a change in behavior to expand that front. What's killing the Israelis at the moment is that they are trying to entice Hezbollah to expand that front, because that means the Americans will have to come and fight with the Israelis and help them. The Israelis are drowning at the moment. They need America to fight their war, and the only way they can do that is by expanding another front. So 2 fronts at the same time, that pushes the Americans to go and help. Hezbollah hasn't given them the chance to do so because they have kept the fighting along the blue line. The Israelis have lost over 570 soldiers along the southern Lebanese front, which is northern Palestinian front. They have over 2,000 to 3,000 people injured. We're talking about active Israeli soldiers and settlers. We have about 100,000 settlers from the Israeli side leaving all the blue line settlements and going down to Rosh Dan, which is basically middle of the north of Palestine towards mid-occupied Palestine. And at the same time, the Israeli occupation forces have taken the towns, the settlers' towns, and they've turned them into a security zone. The settlers can't go back to see what happened to their house. So one of our colleagues from Lebanon, he's a reporter called Ali Murtada, he started standing on the borders, filming all these settlements with the destroyed homes and says, "Hello, my enemies. Look at your houses, they are bombed. But you cannot see it, so we're helping you see it, because the army is not allowing them to go in." So this is the situation at the moment.
So, couple of things. One is that between not doing anything and maximum response, you've got a lot of space. And that's the space that Hezbollah is basically making use of. And so it is responding in a very strategic manner without being drawn into it, because they don't want to play according to the Israeli script. But at the same time, as Leila mentioned, about 100,000 settlers have had to move. They are internally displaced. About 150,000 Israeli occupation forces troops are now engaged there. So they are away from Gaza, and that's an achievement. The other thing that Leila mentioned, this kind of goes back when there was a joint Israeli-US operation against the Iranian nuclear facility in Natanz. They introduced a virus called Stuxnet, and it set back the Iranian program by many years. That was a time when the Iranians decided that they're going to actually get expertise in cyber warfare. And they have. They are now one of the top players in the world. That expertise has also been transferred to Hezbollah and possibly to Houthis also. So this is also the what I would call the commodification of basic weapons. You know, you've got a $2,000 drone which you are shooting down with a $1 million interceptor. So the cost of war increases. You want it?
Thank you for coming here. It's given us an opportunity to actually, understand what's happening on the ground, which brings me to my first question. How is, it being a journalist in these circumstances over there? From what one reads, they have recently also been especially targeting Palestinian journalists, and some have even sort of given up covering the stories there from the ground. Is that true? Because under international laws, I mean, not that they're kind of worth the paper they're written on these days, but they're not supposed to target journalists. And secondly, from our point of view, like the lady here was alluding, we receive a lot of calls for, helping out through various organizations for aid towards Palestine, and, it is pulling at one's heartstrings these days. But does the aid actually, is it able to be delivered there? Is it being routed, and is it being received, or is it all, there are so many bottlenecks?
Thank you. I guess my question has to do with the broader geopolitical implications of what's going on right now. Only last night, Time ran a piece that said that Gaza is now emblematic of the hypocrisy of the West, and a line from it said that the US has proven that it does not have a double standard. In fact, it has no standards at all. And this came out right after
the US bombing on Yemen. So what do we expect, or what should we expect to see going forward with the Yemenis blockading the Gulf of Aden, disrupting global commerce, and then with the developing situation in Lebanon and the supposedly coalition attacks against Yemen?
Hello, Leila. Thank you. So one point that you talked about, you touched briefly, and from a geopolitical point of view, I want to get an understanding. Was the fact that there was a deal happening between US and Saudi and Israel negotiated by the US? Before October 7, there were talks about the deal being signed in a matter of hours. So was that the point when Hamas decided that it was now or never for them? Because before that, we saw that the Gaza and the Palestinian issue was, thrown to the back burner. The Arabs, while talking with Israel, they were not talking about the Palestinian issue. UAE signed a deal with them, and there were many examples. So was it a big factor? Was it a big factor that led Hamas to initiate the 7th October attack?
I'll answer these questions, and if you don't get to ask your question, I'll speak with you outside. I'll wait, don't worry about that.
We will take it.
Okay.
But quick one.
Thank you so much. My question is, where do we see the role of OIC? Because recently a Pakistan-sponsored resolution was passed through OIC in the UN related to this issue of Islamophobia. But we do not see any collective response from OIC related to this issue.
So to start with attacking journalists, the Israelis killed one of my best friends, Ejaz Abdullah, on October 13th, inside Lebanese territories. He was standing with a group of international media reporters. They're all Lebanese, but they correspond to international media reporters, including Ejaz, who was a videographer for Reuters. Open area, no trees, inside Lebanese territories in broad daylight. They were targeted with 2 missiles from an Israeli tank. And the saddest part was that Reuters wrote its statement and the news as such. Reuters videographer Ejaz Abdullah was killed. Full stop. That's the first line. Then the whole statement goes out. Not a single mention of Israel. Not a single mention of Israel. They were afraid to point the finger at the Israelis, despite the fact that the fight is literally between the Lebanese side and the Israeli side. And the missiles came from the other side. So basically, unless God had decided to throw missiles from there, it's only the Israelis. You cannot infiltrate the blue line and then throw missiles from there. You will be targeted by the Israelis if you try to infiltrate the blue line. I picked up the phone and I called my friends at the United Nations Interim Forces in Lebanon. I have my sources there because I worked with them back in 2007. I called the Lebanese army and I got confirmation that the missiles are Israeli. They came from the Israeli side and they are tank missiles. Same day, I posted the news. It took Reuters 7 weeks of investigation to know basically that it was actually the Israelis who killed their own videographer, and they created a whole press conference to talk about their findings after 7 weeks. And I shamed them for that. The Israelis since then have killed 4 Lebanese journalists and media workers intentionally because they were targeted in broad daylight, all of them. One of them was shot next to the blue line and was left to bleed without allowing anybody to actually approach him and evacuate him. He filmed his last video on WhatsApp and sent it to his brother telling him, I feel these are my last breath, this is what they're doing to us. As a reporter, he felt it was his duty while he was dying to send that video to his brother so the world would know that they were targeted intentionally. In Gaza alone, you have over 113, now it's 116 journalists targeted and killed categorically, with their families as well. And I'll give you the biggest example because he's the biggest name at the moment, Wael Dahdouh. They not only shot at him and killed his friend and killed his first son and his wife and his daughter, they killed his other son and his son-in-law. And then they basically targeted 2 of his nephews later on, that was a few days back. So it's intentional and categorical targeting. Mu'taz al-Azaiza, they sent him death threats via phone, and he actually recorded it and put it out. If that's not enough proof that the Israelis with their own tongue are threatening to kill him and target him, aside from killing 116 journalists in Gaza, I don't know what is. And under international law, this is war crime. The Israelis are doing war crime against journalists. So
I'm going to close it formally here because the guys are leaving this room. So the three questions, the answers that are left, you can ask Leila. So please give Leila